What chance did a woman have in a Roman triumphal parade when her body was not seen as a life, but as a trophy of conquest? The answer, as history coldly reveals, was almost none. To the Roman crowd, the triumph looked like a grand celebration of power, victory, and glory. But it was not what it seemed. Beneath the gold, the cheering and the pageantry was a ritual of domination. These women were not guests of honor. They were evidence of defeat, dragged before the crowd as living reminders of who now ruled their world. These triumphs were not decoration. They were political weapons. Rome understood that victory meant nothing unless it was put on public display. If the humiliation of the conquered was not shown in this way, Rome's control would weaken and fear would fade. The women displayed in these parades were stripped of names, status, and identity. They were forced into the role of symbols, not people. Triumphs decided whether they lived or whether they died, but either way, their bodies served the empire's message. Rome conquers, Rome owns, and Rome decides who is allowed to be remembered. In Rome, there was no courtroom for these women, because there was never any question of innocence or guilt. Their fate had already been decided the moment their city fell. They were not tried. They were displayed. The triumph acted as a public verdict long before any words were spoken. Being forced into the parade meant the empire had already judged them, not as individuals, but as living proof of Roman power. They had no right to speak, no right to resist, and no hope of appeal. Their presence was treated as evidence of Rome's supremacy, not as a life with dignity or history. In the eyes of the empire, the parade itself was the sentence. To stand in chains before the crowd was to be erased before the world could even remember who they had been. After the judgment of the triumph came the march, a slow, public walk through the streets where the crowd was invited to witness their defeat. This was not a parade of honor. It was a long humiliation, stretched out so the empire could enjoy the sight of the conquered brought low. The route to the Capitoline Hill became a living sentence, just as the gallows once marked the end for pirates. The women who walked in these processions were treated as offerings, not survivors. When they reached the Temple of Jupiter, many were led away to be killed, strangled, or executed after the ceremony ended. Rome believed that victory meant nothing unless suffering was seen, step by step, by every spectator. The message was clear. You do not just lose to Rome, you are paraded as proof of your own defeat. Before the final moment came, many of these women were bound, chained, or beaten so the crowd could see their helplessness. Rome did not simply display prisoners, it performed their defeat. Iron restraints, ropes, or heavy shackles turned their bodies into a message that everyone could read without a single word spoken. The humiliation was not hidden. It was the point. Just as the whip once marked pirates as examples, chains marked these women as warnings. Their suffering was a lesson meant for the public, a living reminder of what happened to anyone who stood against Rome. The body itself became propaganda, broken, bound, and forced to speak the empire's power through pain. Not every woman taken in a triumph was killed. Some were kept alive, not for mercy but for ownership. After the parade ended, many were absorbed into households as slaves, attendants, or concubines. Their survival was not freedom, it was a different kind of captivity. They became trophies of conquest, reminders kept inside elite Roman homes rather than on the streets. Their value was no longer measured by who they were, but by who had defeated them. Rome treated their bodies as spoils of war, taken to display power behind closed doors just as openly as it had in the triumph itself. There was no return to their old lives, no dignity restored, only a quiet sentence of servitude that outlived the cheering crowds. For many others, death did not come quickly or publicly. After the triumph ended, they disappeared into holding cells, slave pens, or temple custody, where they waited without record or recognition. They were not counted as prisoners. They were not granted trials. They were simply absorbed into the machinery of empire and forgotten. In Rome, erasure was often more permanent than execution. A name could be stripped away more easily than a life. Some were later sold, some were forced into labor, and some died unseen, not by sword, but by neglect. Their story ended not in front of a crowd, but in silence. Rome did not need to hang them to make a point. It only needed to make sure their voices never returned. In this way, the empire buried them twice, once in chains and again in memory. The empire did not only control land, it controlled memory. Rome understood that a people were not truly conquered until their story was replaced with the empire's version of it. That is why the triumph mattered more than the battlefield. The war was fought with swords, but the victory was sealed with spectacle. The display of captured women was not a side effect of conquest. It was the evidence that Rome wanted the world to see. The empire did not simply defeat enemies. It rewrote them. It turned living people into symbols and then into silence. This was not justice. It was erasure turned into ceremony. To the Roman crowd, the triumph was glory. To the Senate, it was policy. But for the women forced to walk inside it, it was a stripping away of identity in front of thousands of eyes. The triumph was their unmaking. Their past was not merely ignored, it was publicly dismantled. A woman who once held rank, family, homeland, and history was reduced to a single function, to prove that Rome had the right to dominate. Her body was not her own. It became an argument in favor of empire. Rome did not need her voice, it only needed her presence. And once the spectacle ended, she could be discarded, hidden, or absorbed, depending on what message best served the state. Roman writers celebrated triumphs as a pinnacle of civilization, but they rarely gave names to the women inside them. That silence is not an accident of history, it is a design. When the empire did not want someone remembered, it did not bury them in the ground, it buried them in forgetting. Their disappearance was treated as proof that the system worked. A name that could not be spoken could not threaten power. A story that could not be told could not survive. And so they vanished, not because they were unimportant, but because the empire feared what they represented if they were ever allowed to be seen as human again. But behind every nameless figure in those parades was a life that once had shape and meaning. These were not mute trophies born for humiliation. They were people, daughters, wives, political leaders, priestesses, warriors, mothers, women whose homes were burned, whose cities were torn open, whose futures were stolen before the crowd ever laid eyes on them. Rome did not conquer them in the moment of capture. It conquered them in the moment of display, when the world was told to see them not as human beings, but as living proof that resistance was pointless. And yet, the silence they were reduced to still speaks. You do not erase someone unless you fear the power of their story. The empire may have dragged them through the streets as trophies, but the need to publicly show their defeat is itself a confession. Rome feared dignity, even after victory. If conquest alone were enough, there would be no need for spectacle. But Rome understood that an enemy could be defeated on the field and still live on in memory, unless that memory was broken in front of witnesses. This is why humiliation was not a consequence. It was a strategy. The same structure that once justified chains and parades has echoed through history in different forms. The labels change, the languages change, the governments change, but the logic remains. Power does not only want obedience, it wants ownership of the story. It wants the right to decide who will be remembered and who will be reduced to a footnote or to nothing at all. And whenever a state fears a defeated person's voice more than their resistance, it reaches for the same weapon Rome perfected, public unmaking. In our world, humiliation no longer takes the form of chains on marble streets, but it survives in who is allowed to speak and who is deliberately erased. It appears in which histories are taught and which are quietly removed. It appears in which victims are named and which vanish into statistics. Rome showed the blueprint. Strip someone of their story, and you no longer need to kill them to destroy them. All you need to do is make their memory unrecognizable or invisible. This is why triumphs were not celebrations of Rome's greatness. They were rehearsals of erasure masquerading as glory. And long after the trumpets fell silent, the disappearance of those women became the final act of the parade. Their humiliation ended on the cobblestones, but their erasure lasted centuries. As Seneca once wrote, "A punishment that does not end in death continues after it." Their fate was not sealed by strangling rope or blade. It was sealed by the silence that followed. What remains is not their story, but the shadow of a story that someone worked very hard to remove. And when silence is this deliberate, it becomes its own kind of evidence, proof not of weakness, but of threat. Power does not waste effort erasing people unless it fears what they meant. So the question left behind is not only about Rome, but about us. If the empire killed their voices in front of the crowd, how many others have disappeared behind the curtain of history? Not because they were forgotten, but because someone needed them to be erased.